For this message called Restore Us, O Lord. I feel like in the post-COVID era, the last 2 years, what we all need and are experiencing, and some are still experiencing, is a desire for the Lord to restore us. Not necessarily give us what we had before, but a restoration and a healing through all the chaos that everyone has been through in the last 2 years. And I think the best way to do that, as I was preparing this message, is the life of Peter. Peter is my favorite person in the scriptures because I resonate with Peter in his immaturity and his passion. He was a man of extremes. He's one of the first followers of Yeshua, and Peter says some of the best things in Scripture and some of the dumbest things in Scripture. To give a few examples, in Matthew chapter 16, Yeshua asks his disciples, who do people say who do you say I am? And Peter says, you are the Messiah, the Son of the living God. And Yeshua looks at Peter and says, blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah. This is actually where he gets the name Peter. His name is Simon Shimon, son of Jonah, because flesh and blood did not reveal this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. And I tell you that you are Peter, and upon this rock I'll build my community, and the gates of Sheol will not overpower it. So Peter says, you are the Messiah, the Son of the living God. And Yeshua says, man, that wasn't even from you. That was straight from God, bro, like right out of your mouth. But it only takes 4 verses later in Matthew 16 where the exact opposite happens. Yeshua says, I'm going to die and rise from the dead. And Peter goes, never, this will never happen to you, Master. And Yeshua turns to Peter and says, get behind me, Satan. You are a stumbling block to me, for you're not setting your mind on the things of God, but the things of men. Peter was a flip-flopper. Peter was all in. Either way, Peter was ready to go. He's all in and he's all out, whichever one is in the moment. There's a time when Yeshua is washing his disciples' feet at the Passover Seder just a few weeks ago on the Jewish calendar. And Yeshua says to his disciples, you don't understand why I'm doing this. And Peter says, you will never wash my feet. And Yeshua looks at him and says, Peter, if I don't wash your feet, then you have no part with me. And Peter goes, all right, then wash not only my feet, but my hand and my head too. Like, just dump the whole thing on me. Let's just go. In the garden, later, when Yeshua is being arrested, the guards of the Sanhedrin come up to arrest Yeshua. Peter pulls out a sword and cuts off the guy's ear. And Yeshua heals his ear. And Yeshua's like, Peter, you got to put the sword in its sheath. The cup the Father has given me, I must drink. There are so many examples of Peter's extreme following, of his passion with no forethought. These are so many examples of Peter's extreme following. He's like all passion and he's no forethought. And I love Peter so much because I resonate with Peter's passion and with his zeal. And he's so ready in all of his extremes. He's like an all-in or an all-out guy. And I imagine, as I have found with people in my life, being a person who has traditionally been extreme and is working hard to not be extreme, but this is traditionally extreme, that people must have been frustrated around him. Here he goes again. Peter, oh man, Peter's always like, bro, you're always so like loud and energetic and like all in. Can you just take it down a notch? And we forget that in the first century, people were far younger than they would be now. I think we imagine that disciples are adults, but they're not. I mean, they are in their culture. It's a whole different world in the first century. But the disciples, at least the original 12, are somewhere between 13 and 30 years old. And because Peter was already married by the time he was following Yeshua, that means that he was in his late teens. By the time Yeshua is crucified, he's maybe 20 years old, probably younger. And it's actually at the Passover Seder that Yeshua has with his disciples. And after that he's arrested, that at the dinner, his disciples start to argue about who will be the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. Because it's a bunch of teenagers. And Yeshua said to Peter specifically, he says, Simon, Simon, indeed, Satan has demanded to sift you like wheat. But I have for you, Simon, I have prayed for you, Simon, that your faith will not fail. And when you have turned back, strengthen your brothers. But Simon said to him, here comes the passion, baby. But Simon said to him, Master, I'm ready to go to you, even to prison and to death. And Yeshua just looked at him and went, Peter, before a rooster crows today, you'll have denied me 3 times. You'll deny that you even knew me. And, well, sure enough, that's what happens. But this is Peter. I'm ready to die and to go to prison. And Yeshua says, yeah, you're not. But there is a day coming where you will be ready to do just that. But before Peter could do that, and it's really not until 30 years later that Peter actually does go to prison and does die and is crucified in a similar manner that Yeshua was, that Peter first had to be sifted by Satan. He had to fail. He had to fail so that Yeshua could restore him. And he had to be restored so that he could be encouraging to others. And for all of you who are terrible at grammar and spelling, you're welcome. This is one of my mistakes in my own passion. But we cry out, Peter cried out over the course of his life, and we have to cry out in this season of coming out of this pandemic, that as the pandemic has ended, but all the chaos, my friend Chris Manginelli said to me recently that everything that typically happens in the life of a congregation within a period of 10 years, all the changes and all the transitions and all the new things and all the difficulties and people move and people leave and all the things that typically happen within 10 years happened in 2. All the same things happened that happened within a span of 10, but they all happened within 2 years. And I think that is true not just in congregations, but in the course of our lives. There's so much transition and there's so much change because things shifted. And in the middle of the shift, and as we're coming out of the chaos and moving into new seasons and into transitions, we have to be willing to cry out to the Lord that he would restore us, because restoration only comes, the best restoration comes from God himself. And much like Peter, as we're coming out of this pandemic in the process of restoration, and everybody's in different parts of, I think, in different stages of the process of restoration, but there are some of us that we need to be sifted, and there are some of us that are in the process of failing or have failed recently, or, well, have never actually dealt with their failure even from 30 years ago. And we fail so that Yeshua can restore. And Yeshua restores so that you and I then can use our stories to encourage others in their stories. There's no more meaningful words in the English language than me too. The idea that people are struggling and find someone who shares in their struggle is even close, similar to the same struggle. That when we share things with people and they go, oh man, me too, the thought is, really? Well, how did you make it? It's the heart that God has put in us to cry out for restoration, that we would cry out for ourselves and for our marriages and for our children and for our families, that the Lord would restore us to what he designed us to be. And many of us have experienced this process and parts of this process more than once in our lives. And some of us are experiencing different parts of this process of restoration now. And if we're not, we will face these steps again in the course of our lives. And some of you who are watching need restoration this morning, because we're all in need of restoration coming out of this pandemic. Listen, my personal life mission that I kind of wrote, mission statement I wrote for myself a few years back, is to show people the faithfulness of God through joy. I call myself the happy rabbi. I talked to my brother recently, who's a rabbi in Chicago, and he said it's kind of funny that when you first started calling yourself the happy rabbi, because I was like, he's not that happy. And, well, I am. I think it's my design. It's in my name. My name, Matthew Asher, means God's gift of happiness. But over the course of my life, since I was a kid, and I've talked about this in other sermon series and other messages, that I'm in a process right now of learning sadness and grief because I've avoided it for most of my life. In fact, almost 30 years. And I'm not good at grief and sadness and mourning. And the Lord has given me plenty of opportunity currently as I find myself in some of the most difficult things that I've faced in my life. He's given me opportunity to learn sadness and grief. And what I've been learning over the course of being in counseling for the last 3 years is that real joy comes when God is faithful, when it feels like everything is falling apart, and he comes in and restores. And he comes in and performs miracles. And he comes in and changes everything and doesn't leave us in any part of the process. Now, Peter was witness of the life and the teachings, the death, the resurrection, and the ascension of Yeshua. And in some ways, which I'm going to show you in a minute, Peter was actually a participant in putting Yeshua to death. And Yeshua knew he would be, and he told him that he would be. And Yeshua loved Peter's zeal, and it's why he gave him the name Peter. His name is Simon. If we were reading Peter's letters now, we would have to say Simon says. But Yeshua gave him the name Peter, which means rock, because that's what he would become. But part of the story in the scripture is that he wasn't. Even when Yeshua gave him the name, he was still a flip-flopper. He was still living in his extremes. And I want to show you today that there are 3 events for Peter which happened in the days that we're currently on in the Jewish calendar, the days of Omer, the 50 days that we count between Passover and Shavuot. 3 events that shape Peter's life and make him the rock that Yeshua named him to be, and helps him to be an encouragement to his brothers, even thousands of years later, as he continues to encourage us. The first event we'll talk about, of course, is Peter's denial of Yeshua, which is in Luke 22. And while Yeshua was being taken to his trial, Peter, he prophesied that Peter would deny him 3 times, and that's exactly what happens. This is the part of the process for Peter, Luke 22, where he is being sifted and where he fails. By the way, today, as you watch this message on May 14th, is the 28th day of Omer, and we don't we know that what happens with Peter's denial happens right as the Passover is about to begin before Yeshua dies. So it's 29 days ago on the Jewish calendar. The second event we're going to talk about is when Yeshua restores Peter, and he restores Peter in John chapter 21, and he shows up resurrected during these days of Omer. Now, we don't know exactly what day that Yeshua shows up to Peter in John chapter 21, but we do know that it's before Yeshua ascends into heaven on the 40th day. So it's around these days that we are currently in that Yeshua appeared to Peter resurrected, as he appeared to his disciples resurrected for the first 40 days of Omer, and then ascends into heaven, which we're going to talk about the ascension in next week's message. The third event we're talking about is Peter encouraging his brothers, specifically through the letter that he writes called 1 Peter. There are 30 years between the second event and the third. There are 30 years, just about 30 years, between the second and the third event. There's days between the first and the second. Peter denies Yeshua. Yeshua dies, is crucified, rises from the dead, appears resurrected within this period of 40 days, and shows up to Peter and restores him so that he could be an encouragement to his brothers. And he is an encouragement to his brothers as he preaches over 30 years. But the writing of the letter of 1 Peter, which happens somewhere between 62 and 64, which means Peter the crucifixion and the resurrection are in 33. So somewhere 62, between 64, the Nero is the emperor, and he's killing all of the followers of Yeshua, and specifically Jewish followers of Yeshua. And Peter writes the letter of 1 Peter to Jewish disciples of Yeshua all over the Roman Empire who are being killed. And you remember, it's what Yeshua said, when you've turned back, you're going to deny me 3 times. But when you turn back, strengthen your brothers. And it's sometime after writing this letter that Peter himself is killed because of following Yeshua. By the way, people don't die for things they make up. It was real for Peter. He saw it all, and he gave his life for it. In fact, according to tradition, church tradition, he was imprisoned in Rome, and then he was crucified. Some say he was crucified up down, but we know for sure that he was, at least according to church tradition, put in prison and then crucified. And actually, in 2019, when my little brother got married in Italy, we had a chance to see the prison that Peter was kept in. It was the VIP prison, and it's probably, and the oldest tradition says, that Peter was kept in this prison before he was crucified. Remember, Peter said, "I will go to prison and I will die with you." And Yeshua was like, "No, not yet." It takes about 30 years for it to actually happen. And he does that. But it's the long game, it's the process, and it's the process that we find ourselves in coming out of a pandemic, that what many of us need is to be sifted. Some of you are being sifted right now. Some of us are in the process of failing or feeling like we failed or not dealing with our failures, and Yeshua wants to restore you from those failures so that you can encourage others with your story and with what Yeshua has done in your life. It's the sifting and failing that then leads us to be restored and to be an encouragement. So the sifting and the failing makes us people who are restoring and encouraging. As we often say at Restoration, we believe one of our core values is every setback is a chance to come back. So we look at the first event, the denial of Yeshua, and this is the way it goes. They seized Yeshua and led him away and brought him into the house of the high priest, but Peter was following at a distance. Now, they had lit a fire in the center of the courtyard and sat down together, and Peter was sitting among them, and a servant girl saw him sitting at the fire, and she looked straight at him and said, "This one was with him too." But he denied it, saying, "Woman, I don't know him." A little later, another saw him and said, "You too are one of them." But Peter said, "I am not." And about an hour later, he began to insist, saying, "Certainly this fellow was with him, for he too is a Galilean." And Peter said, "I do not know what you're talking about." And immediately, while he was still speaking, a rooster crows. And Luke, more than the other Gospels, puts in this line, "And the Lord turned and looked straight at Peter, eye contact. And Peter remembered the word of the Lord, how he had told him, before the rooster crows today, you will deny me 3 times. And Peter went out and wept bitterly. Now, there's this amazing thing that comes from the Torah portion, Kedoshim, which always follows Passover. And it's this idea, and I think the reason why Luke put in his telling of the story, at the beginning, he says Yeshua was arrested and Peter followed at a distance. Why does that matter? Why is it a big deal? Well, it's because actually in one of the Torah portions that always follows Passover, like week 1 or week 2 after the Passover, is a Torah portion, or week 3, depending on the year. The Torah readings, there's a cycle of reading every Saturday that Jewish tradition tells us was established by Ezra and Nehemiah 500 years before Yeshua. And they're the readings every Saturday in the synagogue. And Kedoshim is always after Passover and includes Leviticus 19 and verse 16. And it's just the Torah portion just 2 weeks ago on the Jewish calendar. And we know that the disciples knew the Torah portions, and part of the reason why Peter is weeping is because he knows the specific commandment from the Torah that he broke. And Luke points it out by saying Peter followed at a distance. It's in Leviticus 19:16. It says, you're not to go up and down as a tallbearer among your people. You're not to endanger the life of your neighbor. Okay, well, that doesn't sound like Pete following at a distance, but if you look in Jewish translations like the Complete Jewish Bible, it says, and don't stand idly by while your neighbor's life is at stake. Or more specifically, the JPS, which is clear in the Hebrew, it actually says the commandment is, do not stand idly by while your neighbor's blood is shed. I am Adonai. And that's exactly what Peter does. When Peter followed at a distance, and in his denial, he becomes a participant of Yeshua's death because he stood idly by while his best friend's blood was shed. He stood idly by while his friend was being beaten for things he didn't do. He stood idly by and had to deal with the shame of what Yeshua told him it would even happen. Yeshua said, you're going to deny me. I'm ready to die for you and go to prison. I know. Listen to me, Peter. I love your passion, buddy. That's not going to be right now. First, you're going to deny me. You're going to follow at a distance. You're going to stand by while my blood is being shed. And I got to think about how much this bothers Peter when he goes out and he weeps, because he knows, not only does he know what he did, but he also knows in synagogue it's going to be read, and the shame that he feels for standing by while his neighbor's blood was shed, that the man he had spent the last 3.5 years with, who he believed was the Messiah, he's the first one to say, you're the Messiah, the Son of the living God, that in all of that, he just stood there. And that brings us to the second event. And the second event is the restoration. And what happens after Peter weeps is he does what anyone would do. He goes fishing. The disciples are confused and they're scared. And Peter goes fishing. And some of the other disciples, they go back to what they did before because they don't know what to do. And they believe that those who killed Yeshua are now after them. And so Yeshua then keeps appearing. He's apparently came back to life. Rose from the dead. And over these 40 days he appears. And in one of the time he appears, it's actually they're fishing, just like when they first met him. Peter and his brother Andrew were fishing, and Yeshua walked by and said, follow me. And now Yeshua appears, but he's on the shore, and they're fishing, and they can't catch anything. And he says, throw your net over the other side, which is dumb, because that's not how fishing works. You don't catch stuff on the other side of your boat, especially a little tiny boat like they had in the first century. But they do it, and Peter realizes that it's the Lord, and he jumps out of the boat, and he swims as fast as he can, because Peter's all passion, baby, and he's like, I just need to be with him. And they get there, and they have breakfast together, and it's at breakfast that Yeshua restores him, and he says, when they finish breakfast, John 21 and verse 15, Yeshua said to Simon Peter, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? Well, yes, Lord. I mean, you know that I love you. And Yeshua looked at him and said, feed my lambs. And he said to him a second time, Simon, son of John, do you love me? Yes, Lord, you know that I love you. And he said, then take care of my sheep. And he said to him a third time, Simon, son of John, do you love me? And I love this. Peter was grieved because he said to him for a third time, do you love me? And he said to him, Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you. And Yeshua said, feed my sheep. 3 times. I don't know him. I don't know him. I don't know him. Do you love me? Do you love me? Do you love me? And the third time Peter is aggravated. But Lord, you know everything. Yeah, because it wasn't for Yeshua. Yeshua was doing it for Peter to remind him of who he was. And then he says these crazy words. I tell you that when you were younger, you used to dress yourself and walk wherever you wanted. But when you grow old, you will stretch out your hands, and someone else will dress you and carry you where you do not want to go. Now, John says after, now this was, he said to indicate what kind of death Peter was going to glorify God. And after this, Yeshua said to him, follow me. But that statement of you will stretch out your hands and others will dress you, some say, and I believe is a reference to Peter's crucifixion. That after he denies the Lord, he does everything that Yeshua said would happen. You're going to deny me first, and then I'm going to pray for you that you do not fail. But in your failing, I'm going to restore you. And when you turn back, you're going to strengthen my brothers. So he's dealing with all the shame and all of the confusion of, I can't believe I denied the Lord 3 times, and the excitement of God. Well, he keeps showing up. It seems like he's still alive. Is this real? And Yeshua takes the time to stop. In the middle of all of it, they eat breakfast together. Peter, do you love me? Yes, I love you. Peter, do you love me? I don't know why. Yes. Peter, do you love me? I mean, you know that I love you. You know everything I do. I do. Okay. Feed my sheep, which brings us to the third event, which is Peter's encouragement to his brethren in 1 Peter, especially chapter 5. And in 1 Peter chapter 5, it's around 30 years after these first 2 events, between 62 and 64. And it's the Jewish people all over the Roman Empire who are being persecuted by the Emperor Nero, and many are being killed for following Yeshua. And he writes 1 Peter as an encouragement that he offers from his own sifting and his own failing and his own restoration some 30 years before. And in 1 Peter, especially chapter 5, what Yeshua prophesied 30 years earlier happens. Not just in that Peter dies and is crucified, but before he dies and is crucified, he writes this letter, and he would take these experiences, that Peter would take these experiences and do exactly what Yeshua said. When you have turned, strengthen your brothers. 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 1 says, therefore I appeal to the elders among you, as a fellow elder and witness of Messiah's suffering, and a partaker also of the glory about to be revealed. But part of what Peter is saying here is, guys, I'm not just a witness. I participated. I was there. And what are we supposed to do when we were there? What are we supposed to do when everything is falling apart? What are we supposed to do when we need God to restore us? And Peter says in verse 6 of 1 Peter chapter 5, humble yourselves under the mighty hand of God, so that he may lift you up at the appropriate time. Cast all your worries on him, for he cares for you. Stay alert. Watch out. Your adversary, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion, searching for someone to devour, but stand firm against him, firm in your faith, knowing that the same kinds of sufferings are being laid upon your brothers and sisters all throughout the world. And after you have suffered a little while, and after, I love the words and after, after you have suffered a little while, the God of all grace, who has called you into his eternal glory in Messiah, will himself restore, support, strengthen, and establish you. Peter is saying this from very real experience as a participant and denier of Yeshua, but one who was restored by Yeshua just a few days later, maybe a few weeks later. He's saying, after you've suffered a little while, and he's saying this to his friends who are being killed for following Yeshua by Nero and the Roman Empire. After you've suffered a little while, it happened to me, guys. He showed up himself, and he restored me, and he supported me, and he strengthened me, and he established me. And Peter had no doubt in his mind that Yeshua would do that for his friends, and I have no doubt in my mind that Yeshua is doing that for me, and I have no doubt in my mind that Yeshua is doing that for you. That as we come out of the chaos of all of these things, that Yeshua is doing a work to restore us and to make us whole, and we cry out to him to restore us. Peter was sifted by Satan. He had to fail so Yeshua could restore, so that he could be, misspelled, encouraging to others. Here's what you need. This is what we need. Some of us are being sifted. Some of us are in the process of failing, or, like I've been doing for the last 3 years, working with the things that I did 30 years ago. That God is healing now and dealing with the consequences of not dealing with it for 30 years. But God in his mercy and his grace knew all of these things were true so that Yeshua could restore. And maybe some of you are facing the same thing. There are things you've never dealt with. There's pain and there's grief and there's sin that you've done or that was committed to you that you have not dealt with. And I promise you the work is so hard and it's kind of awful. It's really awful in the process. But if you're able to work through and push through and allow God to work in you, he can restore you so that you can encourage others with the story of who God is. That after you've suffered a little while, Yeshua himself will restore, build up, and strengthen you. And so many of us need this right now. As we come out of this pandemic, we cry out to the Lord to restore us. And there's no greater time than in the very same days that Yeshua appeared resurrected between Passover and Shavuot. I pray that miracles happen in your family. I pray that healing happens. I pray for hope and encouragement and restoration over you and your family. And I'm going to pray the words of the scripture over you in a way that it was written like a letter, not with verses, but to pray this prayer over you. I pray that you humble yourself under the mighty hand of God so that he may lift you up at the appropriate time. I pray you cast your worries on Yeshua because he cares for you. I pray you stay alert and watch out because your adversary, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion looking for someone to devour. And I pray that you are able to stand firm against him, firm in your faith, knowing that the same kinds of sufferings are being laid upon our brothers, your brothers and sisters all throughout the world. And I pray that after you've suffered a little while, that the God of all grace, who has called you into his eternal glory in Messiah, will himself restore, support, strengthen, and establish you. And I pray these things in the name of Yeshua, who answers when we call and hears our prayers. In the name of Yeshua. Amen. I love you guys. See you next week.